All right. Hello, everyone. and Thanks for joining us today. Today's webinar should only be about 30 minutes. It was scheduled for an hour, but it should be just to probably wrap up within 30 minutes. But my name is Jamie Kirsch, and I assist Vicinity with sales and account management activities. Beth Manley, who usually hosts these, has decided to return to her insurance roots. So if you have any questions or need help with anything, you can always contact me. Again, I'm Jamie with at Vicinity. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you for taking the time out of your schedule today to join us. The We've been doing these webinars, these Brewed for You webinars, since the beginning of the year, and we try to do them about every 8 or 10 weeks, whenever we can get it fit into our schedule. But today's webinar, we're going to talk specifically about start date offset. And this is a new functionality that we released in version 4.35, and it'll allow you to help set up different requirement dates for ingredients in a formula, and then obviously then driven off the batch, and then help offset the days that that ingredient is required. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We are recording this, and we will send it out to you as soon as it's available. Also, we have a YouTube channel too, where you can look up our different training recordings that Randy has completed. And we'll include that link also. But if you have any questions during this presentation, please utilize our chat box to add those questions, and we'll get those answered at the end of the main focus of this start date offset. So I think that's all from my standpoint. Let me introduce you to Randy Smith, who's the CEO and one of the co-founders of Vicinity Software. He was in the room where it happened, so there's no better person for this webinar than to have Randy lead us through. Again, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we will address them as soon as we're done with the main presentation. And with that, I will return it over to Randy.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Sure, I'm off of mute. I'm off of mute. Good. I appreciate you taking your time to be with us. We want to go over a topic that we added probably 6 months or so ago, and we're just starting to get the messaging out to people on what they could to do. And that is, we added the ability within a formula to set dates for various steps along the way. So let's take fermentation for a minute. We have various unit procedures and operations, and I'm just going to go ahead and pull one up real quick, that we can start setting some dates associated with certain activities. So let's think in terms of dry hopping is one example that comes to my mind, where somewhere later in the process I'm going to be adding hops. Up until this functionality, what we ended up with was all those hops were being shown as required. They weren't being used, but from an MRP perspective, they were showing to be needed at the beginning of the batch. In this case, it was based on the, this is a formula, based on the planned start date. And so basically MRP would say, oh, well, you're going to use it sometime in the batch. Let's go ahead and make it available at the start of the batch. So we added the ability to basically add dates to various levels of the formula. So we have a piece of equipment, unit procedure. Within a unit procedure, we have an operation. I've got multiple operations here, basically the fermentation schedule, so to speak, the phases of fermentation. And then I've got hops listed down here. Now, what we can do with this, let me kind of put it in context as a use case first, and then I'll show you actually how we're doing things. So I'm going to utilize Vicinity View to help show you some data. But for example, we can have a dry hopping schedule, say by day as an example. So this is nothing more than a query that we've done that basically looks at every batch and says on this particular date, you're going to need to be dry hopping, and it happens to be in my fermentation tank 1. If I go down to this one, I see in 2 different fermentation tanks. So I'm going to need to add some hops into fermentation tank 1 as well as fermentation tank 2. So we're able to basically look at the log number here as well as what needs to go in, and I can put other data here like quantity and things like that. But really, this gives us the ability to start getting some workflow built within the system with dates. We've always had the hierarchy of these are the steps that we do in a formula or in a log, but now we're actually able to attach dates to that process. So for example, let me come back to the formula entry and just show you kind of what that looks like and really how that happens. So at the fermentation tank or operation or hops, any of those levels that we have this ability to use a concept called parameters. We actually added parameters a long time ago, more than a year ago, 2 years ago probably. And that really was there to give us the ability to set settings on pieces of equipment or turn up temperatures or flow rates or things like that. It just gave us some operational data. Well, what we added recently was the ability for us to be able to come down to any one of these lines, like hops, for example. So my cursor is actually on the introduction of hops into the fermentation vessel. I can actually come in and say, I've got a parameter that I've set up called days in. I created that. It's my made up parameter ID. You can use any parameter ID you want to, and you can come in and tell it, this happens to be an integer, we can say offset by 7 days. So 7 days after fermentation, we want to be adding these hops as an example. Now I can do that all along the route. So I can have various items being introduced at different times. I might have adjuncts or flavors being added in another stage. I can have the date in which I anticipate to add that based on the start date. Really works really well in that scenario. Now the setup is really very simple. It's under the setup application and parameters. And I went and created a days in. Again, I just created this ID, whatever I want it to be. And all I'm doing is I'm marking this as a batch start date offset. So in other words, I'm saying, go start with a start date and allow me to take this parameter and use it as a date offset. So all I did is I created this. I marked the box saying is a batch date offset. And when I use it this way and use it, say, days in on my hops, I now can count the number of days from my start date that I'm going to add that. And in my vicinity view, that's where I got this date. Here's the start date of the batch. I add X number of days, and that's the date in which I need to add the hops. And this is hops 2. It's a second edition that I've got going in. Rather easy to implement. You may need a little bit of help on some vicinity views from us to be able to make that happen. Now I'm going to stay on this hop addition and I want to take this one step further. So what I'm showing you is a list of the things that the cellarman needs to go do. Go to this tank and put in this weight of hops or whatever else needs to be done. But I can also expect that in the future. So for my MRP generation, the MRP run is actually doing the exact same thing. So if I go and I regenerate MRP, remember MRP is going to go look at all my demand and make suggestions on batch tickets or logs. It will also look at my existing logs and know when I'm going to run out of inventory. So probably the most important part of this here for this conversation is going and looking at where does MRP see the requirement of this hops taking place? And we're actually going to start seeing it out into the future as I get into some of the older, the logs that I've got. So I'm actually putting this in based on the date in which the offset is designed. So now instead of MRP thinking it needs to be at the beginning of the batch, we can actually let MRP wait a little bit, building you a little bit of buffer in your inventory. So it's really nice, that we're able to identify it for printing on a log or running a vicinity view, but it's also driving out MRP and the requirement of that ingredient. Now, I want to take this a little bit further in a different direction. So we've been talking about requirement of, say, hops for dry hopping or maybe flavors or things like that. I want to twist this a little bit and use the date offset also for QC tests. So let's say we're in fermentation and we're wanting to draw samples starting on day 5 for the next 4 days in say primary fermentation. I can design that. I can actually tell the system to to let me know what I need to be doing when I need to be doing it. I've got another custom view out here. In this custom view, I'm actually looking at by day the different tests that I need to run. In this case, in fermentation tank 1, I've got 4 QC tests that I need to run. On the next day, I've still got that same. I'm going to get down until eventually I'm adding another test or another batch or another log. So this is 57. You've been seeing the first 3 days is 57. I'm doing a tank check on this date, a tank check on this date, et cetera, and so on. On this day, however, I add another fermentation tank to the mix. We added something in, it got to the age at which it needs to start being tested, and now I've queued up another set of tests. Now, all this was done. So basically what we now have is once you fully load your cellar, load all your batches, your quality group is going to be able to go see which tanks do they need to pull tests from or samples from. And by the way, everything that I'm doing is based on the start date. It could actually be based on any seed. Just determine what it is. Start date might be the place for it. You may actually do a test and and crash the tank as an example and dry hop after that, or et cetera, or get to a certain point where another QC test is triggering that you want to start this process. All that is certainly possible because all we're really looking at is an offset from something. All the MRP conversation I just had was about the start date of the batch. But when we start getting more granular into, say, QC tests, you could actually seed that date based on some other date when this event happened. So know that we have that ability. It's actually really simple on how I designed this with this date offset. I'll just walk you through that. I'm going to pick up formula entry again. And more specifically, I'm going to come down to my operation. I chose to put this setup in on the operation stage. So I created 2 parameters for this example. One is on what date does, or after how many days does the QC start? Do I start? In this case, I said 5. And I right now am defaulting based on the batch start date. So 5 days after I start the fermentation, I want to start doing these tests, and I want to do them for 4 days. And so that's what you're seeing in the vicinity view. It starts on my day, day 5, I guess it was, 5, and it goes for 4 days, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the other drops off, and there's another one starting up. But the point here is that I'm able to drive out not just when that batch starts or when those QC tests start, but also how many they happen. It could also be set with intervals. In other words, you could set another parameter that says every 2 days or every 3 days or something like that. So we're able to really kind of dial in that workflow from the lab to be able to calculate the various dates in which things need to happen. I am certain that there are 100 other possibilities and use cases out there, but as we added this date offset, we basically kind of opened up somewhat a Pandora's box to be able to allow us to get in and do a number of different things. With your feedback, we plan to be using these dates and show them in certain places. So for example, today I could print them on a log. I don't know that I've got that turned on my log, but the dates in which we're talking about, we could actually show on a printed log. So if you didn't want somebody coming back to a computer to look everything up, that's fine. You could actually come in and on the fermentation log, we could actually print that date in which they need to be doing the dry hopping. I think I actually did add it right here. Yep, so there's my operation start date, which is the date in which I want to dry hop. So know that we can add those dates, even if the start date was the 5th, we added 7 days and that got us to the 12th. So that's how that works. We're also planning to be adding dates if you guys would be able to be helpful as a display down in the operation area so you could see it within the data entry screen, the actual user interface itself. But I think those are the topics that I wanted to cover. Feel free to kind of pepper me with any questions if you have any. From my perspective, I think it's reasonable to expect that if this has any interest in your organization, just reach out to Jamie and we'll walk you through the process. I think in time we'll have a white paper on how to do it, but work with you to set up a couple of queries, some vicinity view queries for you to see data and do some more work with the data.
All right, Randy, I actually have a couple questions for you.
Great.
The first one is, does it have to be a positive value? Can I set the need date to days prior to the start of the log?
Oh, I wonder if that's like to defrost something or get something prepped, etc. I don't know why it wouldn't work. It's an integer. We'd have to just check and make sure that that value actually takes a negative value. But all the queries that I talked about would work with that. Yeah, it looks like that would work fine. Honestly, I've never tested it. I just don't know what's going to happen with MRP, but we'll do some testing on that. I really appreciate that question, but certainly on the queries that I showed you, that this would work no problem.
Okay. Well, speaking of MRP, do we have to be using MRP in order to use this function?
Not at all. This is really just an addition for MRP. So you're still going to be able to use that whole concept of when should I dry hop and any kind of workflow you want to do. We just added the MRP piece to it because we wanted to be able to move those ingredients to further up in the batch if we already knew. We'll move it down in this case, move it from the start date down to when we think it's going to be introduced into the tank. So no, that's just an optional piece. All parameters come just out of the box. You've got them today. And so you could start doing this whole dry hopping and the QC piece today. That's not really an issue. And just the MRP piece is the piece that gets added if you're running MRP.
Okay. And I think you sort of answered this one. This is my last question. Does it have to be tied to specific components? Can I add this to the QC functionality? I think you sort of touched on that one.
So good question. So I kind of glazed over this. Technically, QC tests are tied to operations, really by definition. So let me close this down a little bit and kind of say what I mean. I'm going to get rid of the parameters because it's not relevant to what I'm talking about right now. So at any of these stages, you've got a piece of equipment, a unit procedure, and in a unit procedure, you have operations. Now I'm going to move this up a little bit because the quality section's right here. I could move the sections around if I wanted to, I guess. But I'm going to scroll down a little bit and you're going to see that the QC tests are actually here tied to the operation itself. So the QC test, you're really defining, here are the QC tests for this operation. So you'd really want to put this QC marker, this parameter on the operation up in the procedure section. You wouldn't actually put it on the test itself, although I guess that's a consideration that we have. But we have already tied all the QC tests to an operation. So without thinking it all the way through, it might be a little redundant if we did it there. So here I've got it on operation. These are the operation start and QC days, and it just pulls the QC with it in effect on my query.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Are there any other questions from our audience with regards to this topic or potentially anything else within vicinity at this time? Okay. If there aren't any other questions, we do want to thank everyone for taking time today to join us. Another thing to announce today is that we are scheduling Focus in March of 2022 down in Atlanta. So this will be a great opportunity for everybody to reconnect and again in person. Again, March, we're thinking the end of March 2022. Let's see what else. And if you have any other questions about your account or how Vicinity can help you maximize what you're trying to offer, just reach out to me. I'll quickly put my email address in the chat so you can contact me if there's any questions about Vicinity. And another reminder is this recording will be sent out to everybody at the conclusion. And again, if there's not any other questions, this concludes our webinar for today. So we thank you all for joining us and have a great day. Thank you, Randy.